Hello, today's video talks about Civil War history in the Cove. This history site could have had a major impact on the war. Today we invite local Civil War historian and author Randy Stoltz to help tell this story the best we can. Today's video is on the Snakespring Gap and McKe Gap trenches. We really hope you find this video interesting and enjoy the history. Thank you for watching. I'm here today with Martinsburg resident and author of the book Civil War in the Hearts of Morrison's Cove to give you a bird's eye view of the Morrison's Cove emergency militia leading up to the Battle of Gettysburg. I'd like to welcome Randy Stoltz.
Hello. Back in 1859, James Buchanan was the president of the United States, and he didn't have a real answer to all the unrest with the slavery issues and states' rights. So 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. After that happened, a lot of the southern states were already primed to secede from the Union. Jefferson Davis was elected President of the Confederate States of America, and South Carolina seceded from the Union, and shortly after that there ended up being about 10 more states seceded quickly after that. Civil War started with the bombing of Fort Sumter. With the bombing of Fort Sumter, the Civil War started. So President Lincoln called for volunteers, and he felt that he would be able to stop the rebellion in about 90 days. So he called for 90-day enlistments. Williamsburg had the Wayne Guard. They went 5 days after Lincoln called for volunteers. Martinsburg had the Martinsburg Militia, and they went 10 days after the Williamsburg guys, and they were in the 14th Pennsylvania. They were both in for 90 days and coming back out before the Battle of First Bull Run down near Manassas, Virginia. Cannon fire was heard here 125 miles from Manassas during the first Battle of Bull Run. Things progressed with other battles after that. Then we're going to jump ahead into June. Really, it was June 10th of 1863 that Union Major General Darius Couch was given command of the Department of the Susquehanna. That included Morrison's Cove area. General Couch had fought in the Mexican War, and he had fought in several battles during the Civil War and was highly regarded as a brave soldier. On June 12th, Governor Andrew Curtin gave a proclamation and spoke of the importance of a volunteer militia in Pennsylvania, because he had word that General Robert E. Lee of the Army of Northern Virginia was down in the Chambersburg area, spread out over about 60 miles with over 50,000 soldiers. On June the 13th, Colonel Jacob Higgins, who was born about 2 miles south of Williamsburg, received a telegram from this Major General Darius Couch, who was the commander of the Department of Susquehanna. And this telegram read, "Sir, can you raise a regiment under my orders? The danger is imminent and immediate action is required. Major General Darius N. Couch, Department of Susquehanna." On June 14th, Union General Robert Milroy had 8,000 men down in Winchester, Virginia, and he was defeated there. And part of his men split away and retreated back to Harper's Ferry, but the other half of the men came up toward what is now Everett Borough, which at the time was Bloody Run. So Colonel Higgins was getting his recruits, his volunteer militia together, and now they had to deal with these men of Milroy coming up, and they were trying to determine whether these men were Confederates or actually Union Army. Then on June the 15th, Confederate General Higgins hit Chambersburg. So that was a blow there that we know that he was there and the Confederate Army was that close. On June 16th, Colonel Jacob Higgins received another telegram. This time it was from Pennsylvania Governor Andrew G. Curtin, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This telegram reads, "Sir, you are hereby directed to assume command of all the forces posted in the vicinity of Hollidaysburg and the valley below, and retain it until further orders or until relieved by an officer of superior rank, by order of Governor Curtin." So that was the 16th. On the 17th, Confederate General John M. Bowdoin was in Maryland tearing up the B&O Railroad, and he was at Cumberland at the time, and he was directed by General Robert E. Lee to take his forces. He was an independent cavalry. He had an independent cavalry brigade, and he was pretty much a raider, and he had between 2,000 and 3,000 men under his command as he performed these raids. And he was instructed to go destroy the railroad facilities and the canals if he can on his way up to Altoona, and that is what his orders were.
Okay, Randy, so Bowdoin and the Confederates were pushing north towards the industrial area of the north. What was the advantages to coming towards Altoona and the northern region of the Union Army?
Yeah, Robert E. Lee was in Virginia during the war, and they were running out of food and supplies. Even though they were winning battles, they were still losing because they didn't have the industrial base that the North had. So the North had more people. The North had millions of more people than the Confederacy had, and they had more industry. And the Pennsylvania Railroad was the largest private enterprise in the whole United States during the Civil War. So Lee thought that if he could get north of the Mason-Dixon line and bring the battle to the north, that he could possibly get Abraham Lincoln to say, let's call a truce. So he came up, and he was going to feed his men off of the fields and supplies in Pennsylvania, where he was not able to continue to do that down in Virginia. So the North just had a bigger industrial mechanism going. They could make more guns in a month than the South could make in a year. Another thing that Governor Curtin had done previous to this time was right after the Battle of Antietam, which that battle was fought on September the 17th, 1862, and ended up being the bloodiest one-day battle of the Civil War. Morson's Cove had quite a few men at that battle, including Jacob Higgins, who was a colonel of the 125th during the Battle of Antietam, and General Couch was there fighting also. So what Governor Curtin wanted to do was to get all the governors of the northern states together so that they could put their allegiance behind President Lincoln. So he invited them all, and they all came by train to Altoona, and they stayed at the most modern hotel anywhere in the country, which was at the time the Logan House. They met. It was a private meeting. They didn't even keep minutes of this meeting, so most people don't know about this, but they signed a letter And the letter then was taken to President Lincoln. And when he read that letter, his spirits were really buoyed up because he was very depressed because he was losing a lot of battles and a lot of men. And he had generals that some would fight, but they seemed like they couldn't win. And he was looking for a winning general. So he was really encouraged, and he wanted to bring the Union back together, and he wanted to get the war over. So after Colonel Higgins was put in charge of raising a militia, this was a volunteer militia. You did not have to go get a physical. You didn't sign up for any period of time. You were a volunteer militia, and you would report and come to work at the site. So there were several sites really from Hollidaysburg south. The first one was at McKe Gap. The next one would have been at Raver's Gap near Woodbury. Then we had Loy's Gap at Loysburg, which was called Pattonsville at the time during the Civil War. Then you went on down to Snakespring Gap and Snakespring Mountain, down to Aches Mill, which was near Osterburg, St. Clairsville area, then on down to Bloody Run, which is now Everett Borough. So all of these gaps were south of Hollidaysburg and all needed attention and needed blocked by request of Governor Curtin. So Jacob Higgins had fought at Antietam, and then his enlistment was up in May, right after they fought at Chancellorsville too, which Chancellorsville turned out to be the bloodiest battle fought in Virginia. And we had quite a few men in the fight at Chancellorsville. So Higgins got out of the Army, he mustered out of the 125th. He was only home a month when these telegrams showed up. So now he's back in, raising this militia, and he has a lot of friends, and he knows a lot of people. So he had a lot of men coming back from the 125th, which was a large contingent of men out of Williamsburg were in the 125th. I'm going to read some of these areas that men came from, because this wasn't just a ragtag bunch of men. There were a lot of men that were not military, but they were under the command of military men. From Williamsburg, Captain Hewitt came with 75 men, and they were dispatched down to the Loysburg Gap and at McKee both. Duncansville, Major Beamer, his cavalry, he ended up with 67 total men. Hollidaysburg, under Captain Thomas McFarland, had 100 men that he brought in. Another Hollidaysburg, Captain Andrews, had another 125 men. He came down to McKe Gap. Captain Williams actually had a contingent of colored men. He had 17 originally that came to help, and part of the problem there was Colonel Higgins wasn't allowed to give arms to the colored men. So because that was an issue, they sent word to Washington, and into the end of June, June 28th, they got word to Secretary Stanton, and he authorized all volunteers, regardless of color, to be armed. So Higgins then was able to arm these colored men. Norrie, Captain Coon, brought 50 men. East Freedom, Captain McGraw had 100 men. Sarah Furnace, which is Claysburg, McCann had 80 men. Yellow Springs, Captain Patterson had 20 men. Tyrone, Captain Bell had 73. Logan Valley, Captain Flex, 79. Gallitzin, Captain John Lemon brought 90 men, and they were dispatched down to the Snakespring Gap. Captain Colbert brought 40 men. Out of Cambria County, Captain McCartney brought 500 men down. So these men, although they weren't military, they were under the command of military men, and some of these men were hardened fighters. I mean, Jacob Higgins fought in the Mexican War. He led a charge at Drainsville. He's out front at the Battle of Antietam. His color bearer, George Simpson, was killed at Antietam. And if you go down there, there's a little white Dunkard church, and behind that church is the 125th monument. George Simpson's likeness is on that monument, which is a soldier. His adjutant, Colonel Higgins' adjutant, was Robert Johnston from Williamsburg. Robert was killed there, and he's buried in the Presbyterian Cemetery down in Williamsburg. Andrew Klepser was from Martinsburg. He was killed at Antietam, and Andrew's brothers, two brothers, took a wagon down to Sharpsburg, Maryland, and brought him home. He's buried right here behind us in the Fairview Cemetery in Martinsburg. So there's a lot of men there that have a lot of war experience. Captain William Wallace was from Huntington, and he was also in the 125th. 125th was full of Huntington, Blair, and Bedford County men. And this Wallace was the man who coined the phrase, "In God We Trust." And in 1864, that phrase was put on the first American money, the 2-cent coin.
Wow.
"In God We Trust."
Very neat.
So Wallace picked the flag up after George Simpson was killed and rallied the men, and Higgins' men were so far up that they had to advance to the rear. And when they did that, there was a battery of guns there from a Rhode Island company, and they flagged them down and said their horses were all killed. So Higgins' men stopped and set up line, and they stayed there and protected that battery through the remainder of the Battle of Antietam. So this Colonel Jacob Sink, he was a foreman in the Pennsylvania Railroad in the blacksmith shop, and they knew that John and Bowdoin, Confederate general, was going to come up and try to disrupt and burn the shops there at Altoona. So he brought 600 men out of the shops.
Wow.
They wanted to protect the railroad.
That's amazing.
So Colonel Sink was also, he was an experienced officer. He had served in the 125th also with Colonel Higgins. And he was a friend of Colonel Higgins, and he knew him, and these guys came and wanted to support, the cause, because they knew what kind of a man Higgins was. So Captain Alexander Bob was from Martinsburg. He mustered a company in the 14th Pennsylvania. When they mustered out there, then he mustered another company in the 133rd. After the Battle of Antietam, when they mustered out at the end of their term, he knew Colonel Higgins, and he brought the Martinsburg men, and they went to McKe Gap because Colonel Higgins says, "You know the area, you know where to go." So he has a map that was drawn up by Colonel Higgins. He drew it on silk, and this is a copy of that map. He put all the gaps on that map, and he drew a little cannon at every place that he wanted those gaps to be enforced. And what they did, there was a man from Woodbury by the name of Wilkinson, and he devised a method of cutting trees, standing them up on end, lashing them together, and filling them with rocks and dirt. And they were called Wilkinson forts. So they cut the trees off the gaps, and they built these forts so that Bowdoin's cavalry couldn't march through. And that was a big part of the work that was done, digging rifle pits and building these Wilkinson forts to block the gaps, keep the cavalry through, because they would have been the first ones that would have come charging up through. They usually led the army. So that was a lot of work, and it was done at all these gaps. And they finished McKe Gap somewhere in late June, and continued to work their way down south until they got clear down to Bloody Run. Dr. Peter Schoenberger was a iron ore magnate, and he owned over 100,000 acres at one time in Blair, Cambria, and Bedford counties. And this storehouse of his was built in 1830. And during the time right before Gettysburg, the militia under Colonel Higgins used this building as their headquarters. And the house that's on the picture, they field was used for men to stay in during the defenses that were being built. There was always talk in Morson's Cove about a cannon being down at McKe Gap, and witnesses have been on the mountain, and there's a site there that looks like it was cleared for a cannon, but there's really no documented proof that a cannon was ever there. On June 20th, artillery did arrive at Altoona and at Norrie Siding. Norrie Siding was the end of the line. The train track did not go from Norrie to McKee, through Roaring Spring, to Martinsburg, to Curryville, to Henrietta until 1872, after the Civil War. So they stopped there, and then the cannons were offloaded, and by that time Milroy was taking charge, and he ordered his men to commandeer those cannons, and they took them down to Everett. So Milroy made the decision that those cannons weren't going to be placed at McKe Gap, that he wanted them down at Bloody Run. So we don't think they ever went down. June 20th, 1863, the acting officer of the Army gave the following report, that all these goods were to be forwarded to Huntington by the Pennsylvania Railroad, and thence by connecting railroad to be delivered to that point of the H&B, which is Huntington and Broad Top Railroad, nearest to Bloody Run. Colonel Higgins is the officer in command at Bloody Run, and the packages was 1 gun, carriage and limber, and 1 case on and limber, weighing 6,000 pounds, 38 boxes of ammunition, and a lot of implements weighing over 6,000 pounds. So these guns were taken by Milroy for the defense of Bloody Run and were not placed in service at McKe Gap. Now, there was a report in the Morson's Cove Herald back in the 1940s that a brass gun was seen being drawn by 4 horses, and this gun had 4 wheels, and it was brass. And we have a picture here of what that gun may have looked like. This particular picture, I feel confident, was taken down at the Ironworks in Richmond, Virginia. So I think this is a Confederate gun. It's a breech-loading Confederate gun, but this gives you an idea what those people may have seen, and put that report in the Herald that there was a brass gun come through the gap, but there's no evidence that it was ever put into action. And the gun that came, they even made a comment that they were disappointed because there was no ammunition. There was no ammunition sent with the gun. This historic marker is down at the square in Chambersburg, and it tells that on June 26, 1863, General Robert E. Lee and his staff entered that square, and General A.P. Hill was one of his main generals, and this is what Lee in that area prompted the defenses that were being set up. After the Battle of Chancellorsville, which Union Major General Hooker was in charge, he had more men than Lee at Chancellorsville, should have won. He lost the battle, which really upset President Lincoln. So Lincoln decided he's making another change. So 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg, which started on July 1st, 1863, President Lincoln changed commanders of the Army of the Potomac, and he put General George Gordon Meade in charge of the Army right before the Battle of Gettysburg.
Okay, Randy, so we covered the history leading up to the fortifications of the Gaps, and where are we at time-wise with where the Confederates were and potentially coming this way?
When Robert E. Lee heard that General Meade was put in charge and Hooker was relieved of his command, that changed General Lee's thoughts about going to take Harrisburg. He had already ordered on the 28th of June for his army to head to Harrisburg. They were going to try to take Pennsylvania's capital. When he heard about the Army of the Potomac being down near Westminster, Maryland, with 90,000 men spread out, and he knew he had about 50,000 men spread over 60 miles, plus he wasn't sure where his Confederate General Jeb Stuart was, he decided that he would remand that order. So he remanded it. They weren't going to go to Harrisburg. he sent A.P. Hill toward Gettysburg, and he sent a note down to General John Bowdoin and says, "Don't go to Altoona, meet me at Gettysburg." So the armies of Northern Virginia were heading south to Gettysburg, and the Army of the Potomac of the Union side was heading from the south to the north towards Gettysburg. And that then relieved all the tension up here, because as General Lee lost the Battle of Gettysburg, they decided on July 4th to head south, and he put General John Bowdoin in charge of the wounded wagons when he showed up. And Bowdoin, in his writings after the battle, said that he had 14 miles of wounded wagons that headed south down toward the Potomac River. And he also said that the windows of heaven opened, which means it rained, torrential rain for days. The roads went to mud. They couldn't see where they were going. They were sliding off the roads. The Monterey Pass was treacherous with wagons sliding off the edge of the pass. When Bowdoin got down to Williamsport, Maryland, to try to get across the Potomac, it was at flood stage. He was trapped. He couldn't get across. Robert E. Lee comes down with his army. They're trapped also. They dug in. They waited to see what Meade was going to do. Meade decided to come down around the 12th or 13th of July. And when he got there for a fight, Lee had put up pontoon bridges and got back across the Potomac River. And the war goes 2 more years.
Wow. Okay, after the Battle of Gettysburg, the Confederates were pushed south, and Robert E. Lee would continue fighting on. Where would this take us after this point, Randy?
Okay, the threat to Pennsylvania was pretty much over, because Lee went back down into Virginia. He got across the Potomac River. And at the same time, on July the 4th, Union General Ulysses S. Grant was out fighting in Mississippi, and he won the Battle of Vicksburg, Mississippi, which gave the Union Army control of the Mississippi River, which helped them with all their supplies, and they stopped the Confederate supplies up through there. So these 4 days, July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, were pretty much a turning point in the war. And when President Lincoln got word of what Grant had done out in Mississippi, he knew he was a fighter and a winner, so he summoned Grant back to Washington, and he put Ulysses S. Grant over all of the armies.
Randy, could you explain your uniform and what the typical soldier or man of the rank that you're wearing wear during a hot summer day?
Yeah, this is a colonel uniform, which is what Jacob Higgins was a colonel, and the officers would carry sabers, and they usually carried a sidearm. This is a working reproduction of a .44 caliber Colt. It's a 6-shot, single action revolver that the officers would carry, and then carried them reverse butt like that. And then this is a cavalry saber.
That's original, right?
This saber was made by the Ames Company in Chicopee, Massachusetts. And what they would always do would be stamp the date, which this is stamped 1864, which was during the war. And then it also has U.S. on it for the United States. Then it has the initials of the inspector. And this inspector is JCW, which no one knows who JCW was. I have the most comprehensive book written by anyone on sabers, and under JCW it has unknown. So there are some of these out there, but for some reason they don't know who JCW was. And on the other side, it always has where the saber was made, which Chicopee, Massachusetts. All the sabers that were made had to be made this exact style. So when you just take a quick look at one, you cannot tell what company made the saber. They all had the same amount of wraps of wire, the handguard, but everything is identical on all the different brands. So this is something that a cavalry officer would have.
Now, Randy, during a typical summer day, today it's 90 degrees. Would the soldiers would they take their coats off, or would they be down to shirts? Or I mean, it had to have been hot.
Yeah, it was hot. It depends. Wool's is a funny material, because when you sweat in wool and there's a little breeze like there is today, you can feel that breeze passing through and cooling you.
Okay.
If they got wet and it was cold out, it was kind of the same thing. You were cold, but yet you still had warmth. Wool was a great cloth, and it wore well. You didn't wear right through it very quickly. So wool uniforms is what they wore. But on days like this with the uniform and the hot sun, you would melt into the ground pretty much, because it gets hot. But that's pretty much what they had was wool.
Thank you, Randy. Okay, we're driving through McKe Gap, and I'm here with Randy, and we are coming right past the former Martha Furnace site to the right, and this is the gap running into Morrison's Cove, and this is one of the gaps that the men would defend.
Okay, a guy by the name of Wilkinson from Woodbury devised a method of cutting trees down, making them about 8 feet long, and then lashing them together and filling them with rocks and dirt and stacking them side by side so that the cavalry couldn't charge through. So right here where we are now is the narrowest point of the gap. They'd cut all the trees off the mountainsides and were making these Wilkinson forts. They worked all night long. They had fires built on the mountainside so they could see what they were doing. At one point they caught the mountain on fire, and they thought that the Confederates were coming, but when they got the fire out, they determined that nobody was shooting. It was just a false alarm. But
Looking down at the entrance of McKe Gap, this is where the fortifications would have been in McKee, right along that gap there. And we are on the site of Rodman Furnace, 1862 to 1873. Rodman Furnace, 1862 to 1873. This would have been a target for the Confederates coming through the gap. They would have taken it out. The Union had, in the North here, had lots of industrial advantages, so they would have been targets during the Civil War from the South. So if they would have came through the gap, they would have been trying to take out these industrial sites on the way to the railroad. Martha Furnace and McKe Gap, 1838 to 1890, another site that they would have targeted right along the railroad. The iron industry was booming here in central Pennsylvania during the Civil War. We are here in Snakespring Township, Snakespring Gap. This is the gap coming from Bedford County into the Morrison's Cove, and I'm here with Randy, and we are going to walk down here and check out these former fortification sites, and Randy will speak on them. Okay, we are at a section of the trenches here, and you can see the obvious entrenchment. This would have all been hand dug, and this was for riflemen to protect the gap from the Confederates coming into Morrison's Cove. And this site was cleaned up by a Boy Scout troop, and it's a really nice, one of the most northern Civil War sites here coming into Blair County. Okay, we're walking along this trench, and what's neat about this site here is it's actually a physical location that you can come and see and visit for some Civil War history. And the militia would have, the volunteers that signed up would have hand dug these entrenchments, and they went all the way across the road there, so they would have tucked in here and waited for the Confederates to march through this gap possibly. And what we know is there was multiple locations with fortifications, but this is one unique site because you can still see the site today. So, Randy, what made this location site a good place to fortify for the Union Army?
Yeah, General John M. Bowden, Confederate cavalry general, was told by General Robert E. Lee to come up to Altoona. And this possibly would have been one of the roads that he and his men would have traveled on to get through this area and then to go over to Altoona. So these men dug these they call this breastworks. You build it up and then you can hide behind them as you shoot toward the enemy, and it gives you some cover that they wouldn't have. So they really did a lot of work here. A lot of breastworks are not near this high or this defined, but they dug this out very deep, and they really made themselves some very good fortifications here that they could hide behind. So this was one of the pivotal locations during the Gettysburg campaign that Jacob Higgins was asked to fortify.
How many local entrenchments did they have here offhand, if you know, Randy?
And back to like the McKe Gap,
Yeah,
was the closest one to Martinsburg and Rolling Spring. Then the next one was Raver's Gap at Woodbury. Then the next one would have been Louisburg Gap. Then this one here at Snakespring Mountain, Snakespring Gap. Then Aches Mill, which is out by Osterburg, and then finally down to Bloody Run, Everett Borough.
and they were basically trying to fortify all the gaps from the Confederates moving north.
Right, because they did not know which path they were going to take, so they decided they were going to fortify them all. Then they could have drew men and provisions to any of those gaps when they actually saw the Confederates coming and determined which way they were going to go. They would then rush everyone to that location.
Now, I'm thinking there was probably some scouts and spies in Bedford County doing recon work to find out where to go. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. There were spies all over. Spies typically would travel as civilians and not be in uniform, so they were truly spies. The cavalry always had uniformed men out in front, on reconnaissance to try to see which is the best path, how they can get their men through. And Bowden had, between 2,000 and 3,000 cavalry, so that's a lot of men, and they may have tried to come up through 2 or 3 different ways. When Robert E. Lee had 50,000 men, you can't use one road. That's why Gettysburg seemed to work out, because there's 10 different roads come into Gettysburg. It's like a big wagon wheel. So the Union Army could come in several roads, and so could the Confederate Army.
Very, very interesting. Some great history here.
This Gettysburg Campaign Pennsylvania historical marker is on the side of Churchview Road here on Snakespring Mountain in Snakespring Township. And it gives you the story that Colonel Jacob Higgins was in charge of these men that came and dug the rifle pits on both sides of this mountain road, because they felt that General John M. Bowden would be coming up out of Maryland and possibly come this way with his cavalry to go into Morrison's Cove and then on to the train shops in Altoona, which, like we've said before, Altoona was the largest private enterprise in the whole United States during the Civil War, and trains were so important to run supplies and men to the battlefront during the war.
Okay, we're on the opposite side of the road here. We were over there earlier. Now you can see the entrenchments go all the way back up into here, way up into the woods. And now this is private property. The owner's here right now, and she let us come up in here. But you can see how far these entrenchments are, and they're very deep and very well preserved. And the men around here sure dug in well to protect Blair County. So really, really awesome history here. You can see they go way up there. And as Randy and I were talking, we need to clarify this, but we believe this is one of the most northern Civil War sites from the Gettysburg campaign. We will try to clarify that at another time, but this is one of the furthest sites that was registered historical. Just a personal thought here of this site, and how I feel about this site is, if the Confederates, the South, would have made it through Gettysburg and would have won that battle, our history could have been forever changed. We were fighting over slavery. The South wanted the slaves for their farming. Up north, we wanted them free, and this was a war over slavery. And if the South would have made it through Gettysburg and possibly came through this gap and would have succeeded through here and made it through this gap, they would have went to Altoona. They could have demolished our railroad. They could have taken out our ironworks here in the region, and they would have taken out some of our industrial sites. There could have been a possible chance of them winning the war. So this site tells a story about heroic men in the Cove that stepped up, and Blair County, to defend our area of the South. And it's a story of what could have been, and luckily it didn't happen, but we were ready, and it's a great story of local history that we should always remember. And I'd like to personally say thank you to Randy Stoltz for joining us on this video. His history of this project will be forever in our history in our community. Would you like to add something, Randy?
No, it's just been an honor to be able to give some of this history that most people don't know, and maybe Byron and I can team up again on another one someday.
Absolutely. Thank you, Randy.
You're welcome.
Boy, I had a great time on this video with Randy Stoltz. I'd like to personally thank him for his great history and his time explaining the story to us here and our viewers. We are very grateful. It takes a lot of hard work and years of research to put together a project like this. I highly encourage anyone to order this book online at lulu.com. The history is incredible. Randy did a great job. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. Please like and subscribe for more future videos. Thank you for watching.